Welcome to another edition of Why Wasn't It Better? I'm your host, Patrick Darms.
And I'm Anton Paras.
And this is the podcast where we discuss hyped up, somewhat disappointing films. We'll introduce the film, tell you why it was chosen for the podcast, tell you how it got made, and then provide a few reasons that answer the question, why wasn't it better? Anton, thanks for joining me again.
Patrick, always excited to dive into these films, and especially for today, I think we're going to go up, and away into quite a treat for our listeners.
That's right. We're here to talk about Superman 2. But before we talk about this movie, just a little admin, a little reminder. We are now on Spotify and Google Podcasts. More streaming platforms are coming shortly. If you've not already done so, please give us a like, a follow, a 5-star rating, and don't forget to tell everyone you know about our podcast. As far as social media goes, we do have a Twitter. Please give us a follow at WWIB Podcast. And if you would like to get in touch with us directly with any suggestions, questions, comments, general feedback, or really anything you wish, please email us directly at wwibpodcast@gmail.com. Superman 2 was released on December 4th, 1980 by Warner Brothers. It would not be released in the United States until June 19th, 1981. It was directed by Richard Lester. Put the biggest asterisk possible on that one. Screenplay by Mario Puzo, David Newman, and Leslie Newman, starring Christopher Reeve, Margot Kidder, Terence Stamp, Gene Hackman, Sarah Douglas, and Jack O'Halloran. A budget of $54 million in 1980. That is equivalent to $252 million today. This was the most expensive movie ever made at the time. Good thing it made a box office revenue of $190 million. That is the equivalent of $871 million in today's money, adjusted for inflation. Superman foils the plot of terrorists by hurtling their nuclear device into outer space. But the bomb shock waves free the Kryptonian villain General Zod and his henchmen Ursa and Nan from their imprisonment. Traveling to Earth, they threaten the planet with destruction, at the same time that Superman decides to renounce his superpowers in order to live a normal life as Clark Kent with his new love, Lois Lane. Anton, it was your decision to discuss Superman 2. Why did you choose this movie?
Well, we do have quite a list, but first, personally, we've already touched on superhero films on the podcast, and we've touched on sequels on the podcast, of course. I have a definite love for comic books. I'm a bit of a comic book aficionado, big nerd. And this one, I was surprised. Like, you were the one that actually brought up to me that the fact that this is a very loved movie. This is a very popular sequel. I have seen it on lists where people have shared their adoration for Superman 2. And as a comic book fan that's already highly critical of anything that comes out for anything comic book related, I was very critical of this film and also of the alternate version. But at the same time, that's the nostalgia for a lot of folks. With that, let's start to dive into a bit of the facts on why this film was chosen in general.
I'm glad you mentioned that it was me that kind of inspired you to pick this. You're right. This movie is really well loved. Anytime you look up like greatest sequels, greatest superhero movies, it's always listed. And I do find it curious because, well, like you said, we're going to get into the discussion of this, but just to give a tiny bit of background. So this is, of course, the sequel to Superman, the movie, released in 1978 to great critical and commercial acclaim. And it made a star out of Christopher Reeve. But more importantly, it's pretty much the first superhero movie. I understand there was stuff back in the day. There was technically the Adam West Batman movie that was released in the 60s, but that was a very different era. The Superman movie with Christopher Reeve, it was the first what you would call the modern superhero movie. It looks dated by today's standards, but I do think it's a deserved classic because of what it represents.
Right.
It had Reeve in it. It made a star out of him. He was an unknown at the time, but it also had legendary actors like Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman in it. And of course, John Williams' score is timeless. And there's an optimism to that movie that people really like, even today. as
Right.
old as it is. I do respect that movie a lot. I always saw that movie as a prototype. It was the first like real attempt to legitimize superhero movies. There was always a seed to legitimize superhero movies, and it all begins with this Superman movie. The Batman Core 4 movies, the X-Men movies, the multiple iterations of Spider-Man, the Dark Knight trilogy, and the MCU, they all owe something to the first Superman movie, whether you like the
And
movie or not.
right, you named some good movies, some not so great franchises. Like anything that sets the tone for really new, flashy, and at the time had not been made yet, a true box office spectacle with a comic book on the forefront. And so, of course, studios see this as an opportunity for new IPs and bringing that to the silver screen, which this film, Superman 2, was one example of not quite capturing the same successful formula, but also led to many other unmemorable superhero films over the years.
Good way of putting it. You touched on how much people like this movie. I just want to give a quick shout out to my dad, who was very early on hating this movie. I remember as a little kid being excited to watch this movie on TV, and my dad telling me, "This movie's no good. I didn't like it." And I was like, "Really? Everybody likes this movie." And he's like, "No, I don't like this movie."
Good take. Very good take.
Tell us how you really feel. Yeah, it's let's talk about the production history very briefly because we'll get into it in a second. But the origins of Superman 1 and 2 goes back to 1973. Producer Alexander Salkind and his son Ilya, they sought to make their own serious Superman movie, and after a difficult time negotiating with DC Comics, they ended up acquiring the rights. The Salkinds would eventually be credited as executive producers on all of the Superman movies. And I'm talking about 1, 2, 3, and 4, not the newer ones. The primary producer of these older Superman movies, the original ones, was a gentleman named Pierre Spengler. To apply a bit of historical context to this, the Salkinds were fairly well-known Hollywood producers who had a bad reputation for not paying people what they were owed. This will come up later when we talk about why this movie actually wasn't better. Now, multiple screenwriters, including Mario Puzo, author of the Godfather novels, David and
Big
Leslie
name
Newman, oh, huge name, David and Leslie Newman, and Robert Benton, they worked on the script with all four of them receiving credit. Several directors, most notably Guy Hamilton of James Bond fame, were associated with the project before Richard Donner was hired to direct. Richard Donner was tasked with directing 2 Superman films simultaneously. Very ambitious on their part. I'm not sure if this had ever been done in Hollywood before. So the original plan was to shoot both films at once and release them in 2 parts. This is much more common now, but I was trying to find historical parallels to this, and I couldn't really come up with anything. Unfortunately, the massively growing budget forced Donner to pause his work on the second film in order to focus on delivering the first, as the producers were eager to see a financial return on their massive investment. Again, we're talking about, just to provide a little bit of context, again, we mentioned the budgets when I introed the movie, but we are talking about $250 million in 2023 money. That kind of budget was unheard of in 1978. The only prior example that I came close to finding at this, talking about this level of spending, was Cleopatra, which was a movie that was released in 1963. Probably a movie we are going to cover on this podcast. And you'll appreciate this, Anton. The budget was 5 times greater than Star Wars: A New Hope that came out the year before. George Lucas made that movie for $11 million, and the first Superman movie was $55 million. That's how much it cost.
Well, that is quite telling.
Yeah. The first movie opened in December 1978, and it grossed $300 million at the box office. That's $1.3 billion in today's money. It received excellent reviews and earned 3 Academy Award nominations, including one for John Williams' iconic score, ultimately receiving a Special Achievement Award for its special effects. Before I get into the rest of the production history, I'm going to take a pause because the rest of the production history is actually our first reason of why this wasn't better. Do you want to start this off, or should I?
Well, Patrick, it's a lot to dig through, and I think why don't you lay the groundwork and then tag me in?
Can do. Yeah. So this is going to be a first for the podcast where the actual making of this movie is the biggest reason why it wasn't better. Shortly after the release of the first Superman, Marlon Brando, who of course played Jor-El, Superman's father, he sued the Salkinds for $50 million, claiming that he had never received his percentage of the film's gross. And he even filed a restraining order to prevent his likeness being used in any sequel. While his restraining order request was thrown out, Brando actually ended up winning in court. He received an additional $15 million on top of his initial salary. The court also ruled that he was obligated to receive, get this, 11.75% of the sequel's box office gross.
Brando getting his.
Yeah, and just remember that he's in the movie for maybe 5 minutes, maybe less.
But remember, at least to think of why that's important, why he's fighting for it. Brando, as part of that Superman franchise, is iconic.
Yeah, he's Marlon Brando. They wanted him for a reason. They got him for a reason, a very expensive reason, but he's Marlon Brando. So rather than having to pay him another cent, the Salkinds opted to actually cut him completely from Superman 2, a decision that would be publicly criticized by their director, Richard Donner. In March 1979, after months of creative disagreements during the lengthy shoot, the Salkinds decided to fire Donner before the second movie was finished. By this point, it was estimated that 75% of the footage had already been completed. When the relationship with Donner started to go south, the Salkinds brought in comedy director Richard Lester, who had also directed the Salkind-produced The Three Musketeers films earlier in the decade, to act as a mediator between the producers and Donner. Despite agreeing to do this, the relationship between Lester and the Salkinds was shaky, as they still hadn't paid him fully for his work on those films. Take note, those movies came out like 5 years before this, so they still hadn't paid him. That's the kind of reputation that they had. Now, Lester only agreed to help out with the promise that he would finally receive what was owed to him. Now, Donner's story of why he was fired from Superman 2 is because the pettiness and greed of the Salkinds, and this is pretty much what the public, as well as a lot of the cast and crew of the movie, thinks. But there's a little bit more to it. The Salkinds have a different story to tell. They maintain that Donner had major disagreements with the film's main producer, Pierre Spengler. Unfortunately, they saw Spengler as one of the original people, along with themselves, who had spearheaded the project in the first place. They felt that they couldn't let him go, and that's why they decided to move on without Donner, or at least that's their side of the story. But most of the cast and crew side with Donner historically. It really sounds like Lester was just brought in as a cheap backup plan once they decided to get rid of him.
Yeah, and this changed the course of history. Of course, the inevitable Lester replacing Donner. This resulted in a Superman film where Superman throws an S on Kryptonians as a way to distract them. I just want to throw that out there as this is a Superman film audiences got. But sorry, please continue production history.
Lester officially replaced Donner, and in order to officially receive a director's credit on the film, he was required to not only finish the remaining 25% of the footage, but also he had to reshoot a third of the already completed footage. Several members of the cast and crew declined to return in the wake of Donner's firing, including editor Stuart Baird, who will surface again in later episodes of this podcast, and notably actor Gene Hackman. Hackman declined to return. This is so funny. It's like a soap opera. Hackman declined to return for reshoots, forcing Lester to use a stand-in actor and a voice double for several scenes. John Williams...
Doing Hackman dirty.
Oh, yeah. John Williams, pretty much the most famous film composer of all time, he refused to participate in the second film due to his intense dislike of Richard Lester. So a guy named Ken Thorne replaced Williams as composer. Basically, his job as composer was to use elements from Williams' music from the first film to maintain continuity. That's about it. Now, the production designer, a gentleman named John Barry, not related to the famous composer, he died of meningitis during pre-production on The Empire Strikes Back, and he also had to be replaced. I'm not laughing at the fact that he died. I'm just laughing. This whole thing is just a soap opera.
Right. It's kind of, now we are touching on the production history, not to derail a little bit, but one of this is not a this is not a reason of why this film wasn't better, but it is something that people have speculated on, that the Superman films and those who put on that act as Superman creates a cursed franchise. There has been not a lot of success for those who have donned the Superman costume, or just horrible situations would befall upon those who put on Superman's cape. And then after a successful first film, the curse of Superman does seem to have made a very strong showing, especially in the production history. But something I just wanted to throw out there, that there is some speculation on how cursed this property is for those trying to take it to the silver screen.
I will push back a little bit. I think this absolutely is a reason why this movie wasn't better. Imagine the tension that all this created on set. We're not even done with the production history. We got more.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not necessarily saying that this isn't a reason. I am just saying that the curse of Superman is not itself a reason why it's not better. That's all.
No, it's a good point. So Christopher Reeve, who actually plays Superman in this movie, he's like, the star of the movie. He was initially unavailable to film Superman 2, as he was in the middle of filming Somewhere in Time, as his contract to shoot both Superman movies back to back had actually expired. Now, the Salkinds responded as any responsible producers do, and they sued him. They claimed breach of contract by, quote, walking off the sequel. So they sued the star of their movie. Really, real class acts, the Salkinds. Reeve was ultimately brought back, but he had major disagreements with Lester and the overall tone of the script following the firing of Donner. Now, due to Marlon Brando being cut from the film, his scenes had to, of course, be reshot, and his lines were given to actress Susanna York, who played Jor-El's wife, Superman's Kryptonian mother. The Metropolis scenes, in contrast to the first film where they were actually filmed on location in New York City, the Metropolis scenes in this film were filmed entirely on the backlot at Pinewood Studios in England. Shout out to Pinewood Studios. A lot of well-known movies have been filmed there, including the Bond movies. Now, Richard Lester, he opted to retain his directorial technique for he was very famous for using a 3-camera setup for shooting scenes, and this frustrated a lot of the actors, as they did not know from where they were being filmed for their close-ups. Since the scenes directed by Lester were in some cases filmed nearly 2 years later than those directed by Donner, numerous continuity errors are present, most notably in the physical look of Reeve and Margot Kidder. Now, in Donner's footage, Christopher Reeve is visibly thinner, as he was in the process of bulking up for the role. Margot Kidder's look changes pretty dramatically throughout this movie.
Huge. Almost like costume changes and physically looking different.
In the Daily Planet scenes and the Fortress of Solitude scenes, her hairstyle, the color of her hair, the makeup, it's all inconsistent. She looks downright gaunt in some scenes. Like, I don't know if she was physically ill or she was under stress. There's some scenes where she looks like Morticia Addams. It's nuts.
Right. And this isn't us just totally trashing Kidder.
No. There's a lot of content you can read about this online. Just Superman 2 inconsistencies. Now, of course, in the wake of all this, Richard Donner was offered a co-director credit from the Directors Guild of America, but he completely refused it. In spite of all the problems, in spite of all the soap opera level drama that we just went through, filming wrapped up in March of 1980. It was released later that year internationally. I mentioned this in the intro. It was released on December 4th, 1980 in a lot of other territories other than the United States because of this Brando lawsuit. That's the funniest part of all this drama. The Brando lawsuit delayed the U.S. release almost 6 months. Now, despite all this, the movie was very successful. We mentioned the amount of money that it made, and we've hammered on it a couple of times now. People really like this movie. It has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 83%.
That's insane.
And it even got a 4-star review from Roger Ebert.
Kneel before Superman 2, apparently.
I'm glad you highlighted it in the intro. Like, people of a certain age love this movie. But the previous recording we did, Anton, was about The Lost World, and we had a long talk about nostalgia and the way it can warp your memory.
Huge.
My theory on this is that a lot of people think fondly of this movie for nostalgia reasons, because think about it, back in the day, this was the only superhero movie that was really around. Look, if you like this movie, you like it. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think I just wanted to add there, like, context always, right? Historical context of what was going on at the time. Going into the 1980s, you're starting to, a lot of films in the late 70s, early 80s are definitely a level of camp. And that is considered what's acceptable for films, right? There's definitely a level of including comedy that to this day, or even looking at it in this day for films of that era, probably makes us scratch our heads a little bit. Even looking at that film when I was younger, I was just like, this is weird, and Superman wouldn't do that. Or why would Zod turn Mount Rushmore into a monument for him using his laser vision? There's a lot of inconsistencies. But again, like you said, nostalgia probably plays a very big hand for why this is viewed so positively.
Let's talk about the second reason why this wasn't better. The two directors. Now, this is, of course, linked to the production history, but this deserves its whole separate section. Superman fans probably know that a director's cut of this movie was released in 2006. It restored the original vision for the film under Richard Donner's supervision, and it was released as Superman 2, The Richard Donner Cut. I have actually never seen this version, but I know, Anton, you have. Is there anything that you want to say about it versus the theatrical release of this movie?
So, tone is definitely one of the biggest differences. Way less, not to say that there's no humor in the Donner cut, but there is better pacing and there is a more serious tone to the film. Certain aspects kind of feel better in terms of pacing as well. Specifically, the sequence of Superman losing his powers and the decision on the why makes more sense in the Donner cut than in the original cut. I mean, you touch on it as well as like the various different styles of the two directors, and I feel like that will also weigh into what kind of films really each of these were both very two distinct different films.
They are. We can really get into it. Donner and Lester they really are very different directors. They have different styles. One of the biggest problems with this film is that the two styles just don't gel well together. You touched on the serious moments are Donner's, while the humor, the overall campier tone that we see in the theatrical release of this movie, that can be attributed to Lester. I find this particular quote that I have here from Lester a bit astounding because he was not sympathetic to Richard Donner's style of filmmaking. He stated, quote, Donner was emphasizing a kind of grandiose myth. There was a kind of David Lean-ish attempt in several sequences, an enormous scale. There was a type of epic quality which isn't in my nature, so my work really didn't embrace that. That's not me. That's his vision of it. I'm more quirky and I play around with slightly more unexpected silliness. It's just crazy that he would say that because he was being asked to basically complete Donner's work and he's disregarding it. Very strange. The result of this matchup in styles was some scenes it's entertaining, but it's a horribly inconsistent movie, and it features very just different visual styles from two different directors. This contrast, if you combine it with the notable changes in the physical appearance of the actors that we mentioned, again, some scenes were filmed in 1977, some were filmed in 1980. It gives the whole movie Superman 2 a pretty disjointed feel. Lester's visual style is different than Donner's. Oh, and by the way, Anton, did I mention that two different directors of photography were used for the different parts of this movie? Donner's footage has this very like old school Norman Rockwell look to it, whereas Lester used a much flatter style. And the turn toward campy humor, it's just a mistake. Richard Lester would only double down on it when he actually returned to direct Superman 3. The scene where Superman is retaliating against the bully in the diner, completely out of character. It doesn't make sense. Now, I have to admit, I am not a Superman expert at all. My knowledge of Superman is limited to essentially what are the movies, but I know you're much more of a comic book guy. That's just not something Superman would do. Superman would not retaliate with a bully like that.
My take on that's always going to be a question that fans will say, is this what Superman would or wouldn't do? I actually kind of think the directorial, I have so much respect for Richard Donner and wanting to have a more serious tone for like approaching Superman and bringing to the big screen, because to me that showed a lot of respect for the franchise, a lot of respect to the IP, a lot of respect for Superman. And not to say that maybe Lester didn't respect the movie Superman enough to create the film and wanting to add campy, humorous elements as that's his style. But to me, that actually kind of leans into perceptions of comic books as for children. If we think about it from that lens, then it fits in that probably Lester directorially felt, this is Superman. This is a comic book. This is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be silly, which speaks to a lot of the misconceptions of like comic books are just for kids or they're meant to just be campy and fun. And I feel like Donner helped breathe more depth into Superman that a wide audience didn't necessarily get or didn't necessarily know of or really perceive comics to be able to provide. Of course, nowadays it's totally different. Comics are for everyone, but I do think that really just shows different philosophies for how one should think of comic books and the medium of them for the audience.
It's a very good point. That's the same problem that later happened to the Batman movies that Joel Schumacher directed. The best example of it in this movie is the scene, or the entire sequence when Superman is battling the Kryptonians in Metropolis. And when the Kryptonians use their super strong wind breath to keep the citizens from attacking them. And there's a shot of a man talking he's talking on a phone in a phone booth. And it gets knocked over and he continues his conversation on the phone that's now disconnected. It's this really stupid like joke that was obviously inserted in the movie by Richard Lester. And to your point, it's like, it's just some cornball stuff. Like you don't have to do that.
Yeah, you don't have to. It's actually, again, it's very much like directorial like philosophies of like what's going to stick with audiences and what's going to fit with what's being put together with the film, right? But yeah. I think that that just stinks up the film so much to have what essentially is a film to show, or a scene to show the strength of the Kryptonians, just play up a gag.
Well, it won't surprise you to learn that Richard Lester had zero knowledge of Superman, the character, the comics. He had nothing. He knew nothing about it, and he was just brought on to finish this.
Yeah.
Here's my take on it overall, and I kind of wanted to save this for the section when we talk about whether we liked it or not, but we were now over 30 minutes into talking about this movie. It's probably pretty obvious to the listeners that you and I don't care for this movie. Here's my theory on it. As much as the first movie did for the genre, remember I mentioned that there was always a motivation, there was always a seed to take comics seriously, to take superheroes seriously, and it all began with the first superhero movie. The first Superman movie did so much for the genre. I think this movie set the genre back because the campiness that was popular in this movie, it opened the door for Superman 3, which is an atrocity of a movie. And if you think about it, until the Tim Burton Batman came out in 1989, the 80s was very unkind to superheroes. It's a bad decade for superhero movies. That's just my take. I really do think this actually set superhero movies back almost 10 years.
I don't disagree with you. It's just disappointing.
What about the next reason why this wasn't better?
Well, we've talked about it a bit. We know that there's a lot of strong personalities. We know there are iconic characters in this film. Let's talk about the story and the characters and what that lent into this equation. So due to Marlon Brando's absence, Jor-El is not present at the opening trial. Instead, they use some kind of pre-recorded voice laying out that the case against Zod and his accomplices. All the scenes where his wife stands in for him are complete contrast to the first film. It's legit hilarious.
During the trial?
Especially knowing the production history, it's a mockery.
Even watching this back, I watched the first and the second one back to back. I'm like, wait, what happened to Marlon Brando? Oh, right, Marlon Brando gone. Yeah. He wasn't the only one gone, though.
No. So Eve Tessmacher disappeared from the movie after she and Lex Luthor leave the Fortress of Solitude, and her absence from the rest of the movie is never explained. So this is due to Valerie Perrine's scenes being filmed by Richard Donner. Lester never bothered bringing her back, so that's a bit of a plot hole, if there was ever one.
Yeah, it's so disjointed.
Yeah.
Now, there are some great characters in this movie, though. Because we up until now, we have been pretty hard on this movie, but Man, Terence Stamp as General Zod, he really
Right.
is amazing.
Right, kneel before Zod. There's a reason
Kneel
why that
before
has such
Zod.
staying power.
Oh yeah, he should have been nominated for an Oscar for this movie. He's such a dick. I love how completely unimpressed he is with just everything that he comes across. His whole attitude is, I guess I'll just try to take over Earth because it's here. And
Not really understanding Earth's atmosphere or the layout of the land, as though just stepping on a planet is just so foreign to him.
yeah, Planet Houston. Yeah, he's really great, and he consistently gets praise to this day as like one of the all-time great movie villains, and I do really think he is. His performance is great for a number of reasons, but mostly because he doesn't ham it up. He plays it pretty straight. He has this rare combination where you can tell he's dialing it up, but he never actually goes for it. He never actually overdoes it. He has this ice cold calmness to his performance. And I mentioned how bored and unimpressed he is with everything. It's great. It saves the movie, in my opinion. Ursa, who's played by Sarah Douglas, same thing. She's completely chilling. During the White House attack, she gives this very memorable, this icy cold look to this like security guard that she kills. It's great. Actually, even the guy that doesn't talk, Nan, played by Jack O'Halloran, he even manages to have a personality. And I think that's not probably, that's definitely the best thing about this movie is all three villains, they do the most with their screen time. They all have personalities. The best parts of the writing were all funneled into these three villains, and they're played brilliantly by the three actors that play them.
Yeah, there's something. So just to kind of speak to opportunity and something that was there, like something that could have been there, is by not having, like, if you think of the first Superman, the concept is the villain is something. The villain does not understand Superman and sees Superman as a threat. Two, it's the villain is doubt and all the concept of what if Superman was bad, and that's where these Kryptonians fit in. And so with that, there's a lot of misconception. You can kind of continue that theme from one. This is what people fear: someone with immense power being able to just take down governments, use their authority to just crush their enemies. But at the same time, instead, a lot of it was used for visual gags. So that's where I kind of felt like there was a bit of a waste of really, like you said, really great villains, and really just did a lot of carrying for the film.
I agree. As much as I like the performance of the villains, the way they are characterized, especially in the final third of the movie, it's pretty disappointing because again, like I said, I have limited knowledge of Superman, but Zod is traditionally one of Superman's biggest foes. And the way that the villains are dispatched at the end of this movie is pretty lame. Like he tricks them into accidentally losing their powers, and he just knocks Zod and Nan to like bottomless pits. And then Lois Lane, she does the same thing to Ursa. I don't know where the bottomless pits came from in the Fortress of Solitude. It felt anticlimactic to me. Again, you know more than I do. Would Superman really murder defenseless foes like that?
No, which is why it did not feel like a very well thought out ending. Now, what makes more sense is sending the villains into the Phantom Zone, which was their prison, but I guess having to pay the extra dollars for those special effects was not in the budget.
Oh, I have a whole section about the special effects that we can talk about in a little bit.
Oh, excellent.
Now, since we're talking about the story and the characters, I want to talk about Margot Kidder briefly. Very similar to what we would see later in The Dark Knight with Maggie Gyllenhaal, Margot Kidder is just not hot enough.
No.
I can't understand why he would give up his powers for her. I'm not trying to jest. I'm not trying to insult her. As someone who has seen a lot of movies, I just genuinely don't believe she's good looking enough for the kind of role that this is. I'm trying to be polite as possible with this. Lois Lane should have been played by a better looking actress. Now, speaking of that, some of the casting what ifs for this role: Anne Archer, Susan Blakely, Leslie Ann Warren, Deborah Raffin, and Stockard Channing also screen tested for this role. Admittedly, I don't know who most of those actresses are except for Stockard Channing, who would go on to play the wife of the president in The West Wing. Now, the final decision was between Stockard Channing and Margot Kidder, with Kidder eventually winning the role. Now, for everyone listening to this right now, just Google Susan Blakely and tell me that's not a better choice. Anton, are you doing that right now?
As you do that, listeners, I'm doing it myself. Oh, hey, like that would have been a great fit.
It would have been a better fit for sure. Margot Kidder, we talked about how much she's not the only lead, one of the leads in this movie. Her physical appearance changed dramatically during the couple years difference where they were doing the filming, but I don't think she's a very good actress either. Now, the idea that Superman would make such a selfish decision to forsake his powers and his responsibility just to be with Lois is kind of baffling to me. I thought Superman's entire existence is defined by protecting Earth and fighting evil. Like, why would he throw all that away? And also, the process of throwing away his powers, it's supposed to be irreversible. He's got that molecular chamber in the Fortress of Solitude. Now, the ghost of his mom even says it's irreversible, but apparently the saving grace is that Lois Lane, she knocked that green crystal off the control panel. Again, look, Kidder is a limited actress. She did her job in the first film. She had a pretty good chemistry with Reeve. But in this movie, she looks like a burnout. She makes a lot of like ditzy decisions when she's in the Eiffel Tower scene and the stuff at Niagara Falls. Maybe that's how they wrote the character. But that whole thing just bothered me. And then Superman, why did he give up his powers, Anton? Like, you're the Superman expert here. What do you think?
That actually speaks to, well, if we were to think of it in terms of what would make sense, not wanting to destroy Lois while consummating their love, that could be one.
Couldn't he hold back? I mean, damn.
We would hope so. But
he does in the Man of Steel
joking
movie.
aside, having self-doubt as if one is worthy enough or not. But in the film, in the original cut, it was just like a quick convo with Lois, and it's like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to get rid of my powers. So it makes no sense.
After he foolishly decides to give up his powers to be with Lois, did you notice that they begin the long journey back to Metropolis in a car from the Arctic Circle?
It's so funny. I'm like, oh yeah, that does make zero sense.
Not only that, when he realized he has to get his powers back, he starts walking back to the Fortress of Solitude by himself, and he's just wearing a windbreaker.
We can just assume it was a Kryptonian windbreaker to protect from the elements.
And the other part, so when he gets beat up at the diner, does this imply Superman was just coasting on his powers? Like, wouldn't Clark Kent still remember how to fight? He didn't lose his knowledge. He just lost his superpowers, right?
Right. And for all intents and purposes, Clark is still pretty built and tall.
Right. The whole... Now, during the climactic sequence at the Fortress of Solitude, you mentioned this, I think in the first couple minutes of the podcast, how Superman pulls an S logo off his chest. He throws it at Non, and it turns into this giant cellophane net that momentarily subdues him.
That still keeps me up at night, man.
As far as some of the other characters go, I just have a couple notes that I wanted to point out. This is actually stuff I enjoyed. So you've seen the older James Bond movies. Did you notice Clifton James? He plays the county sheriff in this movie. He plays a very similar role named Sheriff J.W. Pepper in 2 of the Roger Moore Bond movies. Now, those Bond movies,
keep a lookout for that.
Those movies preceded this. So they had to have cast him in this movie based on his role in these 2 Bond movies that came out years before.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to give a shout out to that because this is one of the very few parts of this movie that I actually enjoyed. Now, Shane Rimmer, another Bond veteran, he plays the NASA mission control technician who's trying to get in touch with the astronauts. He plays the exact same role in the Bond movie You Only Live Twice from 1967. And he was typecast so much in this role that Christopher Nolan ended up casting him in the exact same type of role in Batman Begins. He plays the Gotham City subway control room guy.
Oh,
he's super old at that point, but Nolan is a Bond fan, so he must have cast him because of that role. And the other NASA control room technician in this movie, Superman 2, did you notice who played him?
No.
John Ratzenberger. John Ratzenberger, the guy he had the big role in Cheers, and he is a veteran of Pixar voice acting. He's in
Norm?
almost, not Norm. I think he plays Cliff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's the other control room technician in this movie. Well, that's it. Let's talk about the last reason why this wasn't better, the effects. I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that normally with old movies, I think it's very unfair to criticize the effects because just like with any evolution of special effects, when you're talking about movies that are 10, 20, 30, 40 years old and older, right? You have to grade it on a curve, right? Obviously, the
Right.
special effects from the 1970s aren't going to look as good as stuff from now, but do they look good for their time? Well, I wanted to bring this up because the first Superman made extensive use of front projection for the flying scenes. It's pretty convincing for 1978. Yes, it looks dated by today's standards, but you can tell they spared no expense. Again, the amount of money they spent, you could really see where the money went in the first movie. But for this one, it seems like they went on the cheap. They used a lot of blue screen compositing for the flying, and it looks downright awful. I can see you're itching to talk about this, so please take over.
It's I just feel like when we think of context and does it look good for the time, are there visible areas where this looks like they didn't put in a lot of effort? Maybe that's a like if I was going to explain like I'm 5 to our listeners, just being able to let them know or just being able to identify like what visibly looks like they put in the least amount of effort possible to put it on the screen. And I think that's why, especially for Superman 2, it is very clear that there wasn't as much effort put into how to make things or how to make the special effects look on screen more than it was let's piece together the film and use the effects to just tape it together.
It's astoundingly bad in this movie. There's matte lines visible all over the place. There's several parts where you can actually see the camera shaking. There's even a shot, I don't know, I might have texted you about this when I was rewatching it recently. There's a shot where Superman or one of the characters is flying towards the White House, and the background image of the White House is just a still photo. Like the fountain in front of the White House is just not even moving.
Just a photo.
I'm serious. The scene in Idaho, East Houston, Idaho, where Zod and company attack the town, when he uses his like laser tractor beam to levitate the guy with the shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
The guy that he's levitating becomes translucent against the sky because of the poorly done matte lines. And then when he drops him, it's clearly on like a trampoline covered with dirt. And I don't know if you noticed this too, but the kid who begs him, he's like, please let my dad down. He has an English accent, but it's supposed to be in Idaho. Obviously, they filmed the movie in England, but it's like they didn't even get that little detail right.
One note, you have in the notes here that it was like David Lynch Dune bad. Am I remembering correctly? Like Dune that had the film where the villain could inflate and actually like go into like would while giving a monologue inflated and went into the ceiling. Was that that film?
Yes, he had basically he had like a belt that could enable him to like hover and like move around.
Okay.
Now, I guess I should say the David Lynch Dune has a lot of effects in it. Some of them are good, some of them are horrendously bad.
But this was just lazy. Like Superman 2 was just lazy.
Yeah, I think the only part of the movie's effects that I actually thought were good is when the 3 villains land on the moon and kill the 3 astronauts. I actually thought the gravity effects you remember when Ursa tries to grab the badge off the first astronaut, and he starts to run away from her, and he's running kind of slowly, and it's like hoppy because of the gravity. Right. I actually thought that was pretty well done. It wasn't like everything in this movie looked bad, but the street scenes, as I mentioned before, they were filmed on a set. A lot of people praised the giant fight in Metropolis. I found it boring. To me, it felt like the entire battle was happening in slow motion. And there's a lot, again, we mentioned the phone booth gag. There's the cigarette truck gag. There's too much humor. There's too much cornball stuff thrown into this, what is supposed to be this giant dramatic battle.
Yeah, I think like I did want to like speak to that note on you could tell it was filmed on a set. I am a proponent of great sets. I do think that it is such an art to be able to make a set piece look like you're in New York. I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing if a film filmed all of their scenes on set and said it was in New York. There is a beauty to shooting on location, but there's such a like that's film, it's transformation. I think it's the question of that second part, and it looks like it's so sloppy that it's distracting, that you can tell that this isn't a real street of New York. So I think that's just the distinction I want to make there for the listeners.
It's a very important distinction. And I agree with you. I don't want to say I'm a big fan of production design, because that's not quite fair, but I am someone who, obviously you and I, because we're even doing this podcast, we're hypersensitive to all of the technical aspects that go into these movies. But it's not because we don't like them, it's because we appreciate them so much. I absolutely love production design. I'm obsessed with production design. That's actually one of the few categories at the Academy Awards that I actually do care about. I'm always interested in which movies get nominated for production design and costume design and effects. Those categories to me are often more interesting than the major ones like picture, director, and actor and writer and stuff like that.
Because those build the world, right?
Yes. And the distinction that you made between the first Superman and this one, the first one was so obviously filmed on location in New York. And this one, I understand they have to film that giant battle on a set. I get that. But the effects don't help. The stupid jokes don't help. Even to me, the music felt watered down. Now, we mentioned John Williams backed out of this movie. John Williams' music is fantastic, but you can tell this score to this movie is just nothing more than recycled John Williams cues. Is there anything else you want to say about our reasons for, why this wasn't better? We talked about a troubled production, the distinct difference between the two different directors, Donner and Lester. We talked about the story choices they made. We talked about the character decisions that they made, and we kind of ended it with talking about the special effects. Anything else you want to add, Anton?
Just wanted to comment that this is just like a real life example that I saw a lot of parallels with this film. So back when I was in college, fun fact, I was actually originally my first couple of years in college, I was a music education major. And one course that I really enjoyed was the conducting course for conducting for voice. And I love to throw in a good joke. I love to throw in I like to make people laugh, put a smile on their face. So I definitely hammed it up a bit doing the conducting. And I remember having a discussion with just a feedback session with, my colleague, my fellow classmates. And one of the things they mentioned was, we appreciate that you want to put that you want to make us laugh, that you want to make the jokes, but there's a better pacing for it, especially when the subject matter is important or you're trying to make a case. There's a time and a place. And effective conducting, trying to get the most out of a session, you can't always be telling jokes. Sometimes those things will come naturally, but you got to get the job done. And I feel like for a story and for a film that really had from the first film, a lot of momentum on what a superhero film can be and should be to tell a strong, important story, there was too much campy humor and other areas that distracted from what could have been more greatness.
That's interesting. I did not know that about your education. That makes a lot of sense. The point about
Thank you.
Don't try too hard to make the jokes.
Exactly. There's a time and a place.
Well, now we're at the part of the podcast where we tell the listeners whether or not we liked this movie, and we sum it up. I usually ask you what you think first, but this time I'll go first. You can probably figure this out at this point. I do not care for this movie. I know a lot of people do. I dislike this movie so much that I seriously considered giving it an F rating. The only reason I didn't is because of how much more of an atrocity Superman 3 is. Now, out of respect for my own time, I have never actually seen the fourth Superman movie.
The Quest for Peace?
Yeah, I've never seen it.
Good, don't.
Yeah, that's what everyone tells me. It's everything that I've learned about it is universally acknowledged as not only one of the worst movies of the 80s, but one of the worst movies ever made. I rate Superman 2 a D-. That is the lowest rating I have given a film so far on this podcast. This is one of those movies where I am just convinced people only say they like this because of nostalgia. to bring it back to what we talked about at the beginning of this episode. I seriously challenge anyone to rewatch this and tell me that they think it's good. It's silly, it's cheap looking, especially when you watch this back to back with the first movie. The subpar music, Lester's visual style, the campy humor, it's just a gigantic downgrade from the first movie. With the exception of Terence Stamp's performance as Zod and Sarah Douglas as Ursa, I think she was outstanding.
Mhm.
And aside from a handful of scenes, like Zod and when Zod and his companions attack the astronauts on the moon, I liked that one. I liked the attack on the White House. Some of the Clark Kent stuff was okay. We haven't even talked about Gene Hackman. He's good in this movie. He doesn't have to do a whole lot, but I know some of those scenes were directed by Donner. Outside of that stuff that I just mentioned, I think this movie is horrible. The only positive thing I can say about it is the performances that I mentioned. That is it. Anton, take it away.
Very well said. I have to give this film a solid D. Not quite as low, but still in the same range, the D range. I think that it was just a mess of a film that was hacked together with, as we've talked about, a very, very messy production history, and with that, a very disjointed feel for a film that I could not enjoy, even without even without the context of what went on with the production history, or without the context of all of the issues that we've talked about. Just even watching the film, just not enjoyable. Now, I will say, when I did rewatch it recently, there were moments where I laughed, but it wasn't because necessarily of the campiness or that the jokes were able to land, but because it was so absurd, the
You were
kind
laughing
of
at
jokes that were being put on that screen.
You were laughing at it.
I was laughing at it, and I feel like that's a very cheap kind of laugh that the film's able to get from me. And for me, that's why it's a D.
You shouldn't be laughing at a Superman movie. You should be
Right.
laughing with some of the jokes, but not at it. Well, that's it for Superman 2. It is now technically my turn to choose a movie. Up until this point, everything that we've reviewed and discussed, you and I have, I would say for the most part, agreed on
Right.
everything.
Right.
I'm wondering when we are going to have our first divergence in terms of our ratings. I would like to select a movie for our next episode that I think we may disagree on based on previous conversations that we have had.
Okay.
I would like to go in the direction of a little bit more art house, a little bit
All
more
right.
a little bit more bougie, a little bit more boutique. I would like to select a movie that is made by a filmmaker who probably hates Superman 2 as much as we do, but for different reasons, because I don't think he likes superheroes at all. I am going to select our first Martin Scorsese movie, and I would like to talk about Gangs of New York.
Boom. And we are going to enjoy ourselves a conversation.
We are. I have not seen Gangs of New York in, I would say, the last time I watched it was probably in 2007 when I was in college. So I am very curious to revisit this movie. When was the last time you saw it?
Last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Anton's like, dude, I got this. Don't worry about it.
Dude, I love this movie.
Okay. I don't.
Yeah.
Well, I should say I didn't in 2007. Maybe I've changed my mind. 16 years is a long time.
Some things are pretty cringe, did not translate well over the years, but I'll let you watch that.
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it.
Okay.
And
Fun,
that's it for
fun,
this.
fun.
That is it for this edition of Why Wasn't It Better? We will see you next time.
Take care, listeners.